From food and fashion to music, films, and TV content, there's no denying that Korean culture is very hip now and in demand. And riding that cultural wave is Korean literature, which was largely maybe unknown to the world until 2016, when The Vegetarian by Hangang won the prestigious Man Booker International Prize. And we know that the global interest in K-Lit would not be where it is without the work of great translators. And joining us this morning is someone who is arguably Korea's most renowned translator, Brother Anthony of Taizé. He has published some 50 volumes of English translations of modern Korean literature, mainly poetry, won numerous translation awards, and is currently an emeritus professor at Sogang University and chair professor at Hanguk University. Good morning, Brother Anthony, and thank you very much for coming into the studio today.
Hello, yes, good morning. Very cold morning.
It's very cold. It's the coldest morning this year, I believe, and we're very grateful that you joined us here today. All right, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with your works because they are lovers of English literature and maybe translations of Korean works. But let's get to know you a little bit for those who may not know you personally. I did not know this, but you came to Korea first 40 years exactly. That was in 1980 at the invitation of Cardinal Kim, the Catholic Archbishop of Seoul. When you decided to accept this invitation, did you have any idea that first sort of step into Korea would last for 40 years?
Well, I don't think I had any idea. Of course, it wasn't a personal invitation. It was an invitation to our monastic community of Taizé in France. So I came with other brothers, invited as a brother of Taizé, but I had no idea. We had no idea what would happen or what we would do here. And one thing led to another.
Right.
One year ran into another, and time went on.
So you came in 1980, but I understand that you started translating Korean literature in the late 1980s. So less than 10 years into your stay is when you started to translate. I want to ask you, why did you start doing that? Were there no good English translations or maybe not enough translators? Or was there something that you wanted to be known in English? What got you started?
Well, I started, of course, by learning some Korean, and very difficult. And then I became, unexpectedly, a professor of English literature at Sogang University, teaching Shakespeare and older literature. And then one day I said to a professor that I would like to learn a bit about modern Korean poetry. My Korean not very good, but I would like to see it and maybe translate some poems so I could understand better what was being said. And that was really how it started. This professor, she introduced me first to the work of Sang, who was a personal friend of hers. And she said, well, he's very simple, he's religious, but very down to earth. You should find that accessible and interesting to translate.
And was it?
Yes. And then I met him, and he's a very nice, already elderly senior poet. And of course, there were other translators, some of them, but quite a few of them were either Korean professors of English literature who'd lived a little while abroad, or missionaries from abroad who mostly didn't know much about English literature.
So your background in also teaching English literature, and I guess your religious background as well, got you sort of started with this particular poets, but then you went on to translate the works of dozens of poets. What hooked you? I mean, was it your love of the Korean literature in general, or did you think that your ability to translate it maybe in a different way than the other translators, you almost felt a duty to do it? What kind of kept you going?
Yeah, well, I sometimes say I'm a compulsive translator. I can't stop. I need this. It's my hook. It's my.
You do this for pleasure.
I don't smoke, and there are lots of things I don't do. But translating poetry and translating fiction sometimes somehow keeps me going, keeps me alive, and I don't know. It's just, I often say, oh, it's my hobby.
I'm not sure. I've done a little bit of translation work, not for literature, but corporate stuff and a variety of stuff and media stuff. And I have to say, translation is so subjective, especially from the client's perspective or the original sort of writer. They may not like a choice of a word or whatnot. And it is almost a thankless task, I think, in many ways. It's very, very difficult to achieve an end result that satisfies both sides. So there are many, many challenges, but you said it's always like a hobby, like something that you are addicted to. What is it about translation that appeals to you so much? I'm curious.
Oh, it's the challenge. And I mean, Korean and English are just so different. Actually, that gives the translator more freedom.
Right.
Because it's quite impossible to say exactly what the Korean is saying. You have to find a way of saying more or less something similar.
Right.
But in completely different words, different order of words. And of course, for a different context, a different culture. So you're free. If I translate French-English, as I do sometimes, well, they're much closer culture-wise, language-wise. It's actually more tricky. Korean is fun. It's in challenge. Every word is a challenge.
I understand that the sort of boom or recent sort of boom and interest in Korean literature can be sort of parallel to the number of translators that are working now in many different countries that have become interested in Korean works and are translating it in their own languages. That's what a lot of the experts are seeming to say, that this ability to appeal to their local audience by, appealing to their sensibilities is a big thing. Do you agree that it's the quality of the original work that's most important in getting a work or a writer known overseas, or is it much more dependent on the quality of the translation itself?
Well, I think one reason why now you're having more Korean novels, like thrillers and suspense stories, these dark stories, Korean writers are writing works which can appeal more if they're well translated. Than in the past, Korean writers were very much writing about Korean history, Korean reality, Korean tragedy, Korean conflicts. It was all very Korean.
Local-centric, yes.
Whereas now often the writers, the younger writers, they're very cosmopolitan, or almost deliberately not being too Korean. And therefore, if you translate that in a lively, fairly free way, as the younger translators do, then you're going to have a commercial success. This is not really literature. It's writing.
So you need a foundation of very, I guess, maybe global or timely content that can appeal to an overseas or a wider audience, and then has to be translated to reflect
for commercial purposes.
All right. I was wondering, like with the vegetarian, the translator for that, Hangang's work, I understand she had only learned Korean for about 7 years. And I don't know if that gave her an edge because she was more maybe comfortable with English or whatnot. Having translated for, I imagine, about 30 years now, is it easier for you to translate now that you are more maybe familiar with the Korean language and Korean culture, or do you find it actually more difficult?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, you just go on doing it. But of course, the thing is, I am not bilingual. There are translators who are really bilingual. They have the dictionary in their head, and I don't. So I'm all the time checking, and ask people to help me because Korean is too difficult. Awful.
I think a lot of Koreans will say that about English. It's just so difficult.
But Korean doesn't even have a subject. We don't know who is speaking.
True. So I imagine it's still a challenge, and of course, language evolves. And then when it comes to poetry, which you specialize in, it's even more simplified, and you have to read more sort of meaning into it, which makes your work more challenging, but also more remarkable as well. Let's talk about your recent work. You translated 2 works by Korea's most maybe loved lyrical poet, Chung Ho-seung, titled Loving, which is a short story, and Lonesome Jar, Poetic Fables. I think he is very well known for his poetry, and because so many of his poems have also been turned into folk songs and very popular songs. Tell us a little bit about maybe the first work, Loving.
Yeah. First of all, let me say I've translated 2 volumes of poetry by Chung Ho-seung.
As well.
I know
Okay.
him well. His birthday and my birthday are the same day.
Are they right? Oh, what day is
January 3.
that? Oh, it's coming up soon then.
Yep.
Okay.
And
Happy birthday
he's
in
much
advance.
younger than me. He's 9 years younger than me. But anyway, so that having translated his poetry, then there was this story of Loving, which is a fantasy work. The main character of Loving is a brass fish.
Brass fish?
A brass fish hanging underneath a wind bell on the eaves of a hall in Unjusa Temple down near Gwangju. And then when the poet went there one day, he saw that the fish was missing from one of the bells. So he began to imagine, where has that fish gone? And the story is that this fish comes alive and is a kind of flying fish. Sometimes it's more like a bird, sometimes like a fish. And it goes all over the world having adventures, quite dangerous adventures, but at the same time also meeting creatures and people and experiencing love through what they do. There are even cases where this or that creature sacrifices its life for him,
For the
her.
fish.
So it's a fable where this fish discovers the meaning of life in love, and suddenly realizes that actually the meaning of life for this fish is to be the fish of a windbell, and that flying around the world is no good at all.
So he comes back.
So he comes back where the other fish on the other end of the temple hall has been waiting, loving and waiting all the time for the other one to come back.
Lovely story.
That's
I had
lovely.
no idea that it would be about a brass fish, but that sounds lovely. What about Lonesome Jar, Poetic Fables? Now, again, I was just given the book. It's kind of borrowed, actually, by Jennifer, but it is out, and Lonesome Jar. The jar, 항아리, of course, but the lonesome, I think, is a kind of a recurring theme among Chung Ho-seung's works, is it not? Tell us about this. Yes.
Yeah, even God is lonely, he says.
Yes.
But, actually, it's the publisher who felt that jar would be too short, so they wanted a something jar, and ended up with Lonesome Jar. This is 20 short fables. Chung Ho-seung is a public speaker. He travels all over the place talking. And so the 20 fables here are fables about life, fables often about conflict and resolution, about finding the right way to deal with difference, high tide and low tide, fire and water, sometimes real conflict and sometimes resolution and happiness fulfillment. And the title story, the jar, the lonesome jar, I think it's perhaps the best story in the book. It's the first one. A young potter, starts to make pots. His grandfather were potters. He makes a pot, and it's a very bad pot. Doesn't look good. It's a pot, but he's disappointed, and he sort of rejects it and uses it to collect urine, which is then used to fertilize the fields. So, fertilizing the fields, producing crops, that's good, but still it's urine. And then time goes by, the potter dies, the pot is abandoned. But the potter's son becomes a Buddhist monk and establishes a temple on that land. And so they built the temple and the halls, and they have a big bell pavilion with a big bell. And the monk is unhappy. The bell doesn't sound right. It sounds sort of poor and weak. Then he suddenly notices this hangari, this pot. He says, right. And we bury that directly beneath the bell as an echo chamber, resonance chamber. So the pot is taken and buried beneath the bell. And when you ring the bell, then the sound goes down into the pot, gets amplified and enriched, and comes out, and the bell sounds lovely, and everybody's happy. So the pot, too, then is happy because having waited so long alone, finally his being, his existence, has found meaning and fulfillment.
That is another very lovely story as well. I have to say, when you think of the Lonesome Jar, you think of it's going to have like sort of a sad ending, but it's a very lovely sort of happy ending.
Oh, it's a happy ending. It's very happy.
And listening to you, Brother Anthony, I have a feeling that you're an amazing storyteller as well. You are very good at telling stories, and I imagine
I love stories.
and narrating as well, which kind of reminds me of an interview that I read with Chung Ho-sung, and I think you were there at the same time. And he said that he preferred your translation, I think, to the Myeongdong Sangdang, a poem that he had written. And you said, well, I don't have fancy words, but I like poems that read well, when you narrate well. Why is that so important? I was just kind of struck by that.
Poetry is so rooted in spoken language, although now we just read it on the page, and especially Korean literature. Korean poets often can't read poetry very well. But poetry is meant to be spoken. And when I read my translations, I quite often notice that they sound good. They read very well. I mean, I'm not conscious. This simply is how it comes out.
The rhythm and
and the flow and the play of sounds and all of that. I'm not at all a technician of language, of poetry, but it happens. So it must be that this is part of my vocation. Or I don't know if it's a gift, but anyway, it's something I do.
Do you think that maybe you are unique in paying attention to the vocalization of poems too?
No. But some people are more conscious. There's the other translator who died a few weeks ago, Kevin O'Rourke. He'd been in Korea much longer than I am, and he translated a lot of classical Korean poetry. And he's from Ireland. And his translations are so Irish. And Irish poetry is oral, much more than English literature. It's less literary, more lively, and has substance.
Grit, maybe, a little bit of...
Crunchy.
Very interesting. I have time for maybe one last question. I wanted to ask you, because we have heard, especially with the Literature Institute of Korea, that there are more students that are interested in becoming translators, or maybe they are translating already. As someone who has so much experience, what is your advice to them?
Well, the main advice, of course, is you cannot earn a living translating literature.
Oh, no.
Certainly
really?
not poetry. So you have to be realistic about it, that translating can only be a hobby or a part-time job, if you like.
Even with so much more interest in K-Lit and more demand?
How many books are being published? A handful. And even if they're published, the translator gets, 2% royalty if she's lucky.
Do you sometimes approach publishers about their books and ask if you can translate it, or is it always the other way around?
I don't really, it often happens. Now I'm working with an agent in New York who sometimes asks me to translate a book. But then sometimes she cannot find a publisher for the translation.
I see.
But the young translators, they're in the Ponnet one in the Translation Institute, struggling to start and establish a reputation. But you mustn't translate in order to become famous. You must
famous or earn money.
As a servant. The translator is a servant.
The other flip side then, what should more publishers do to help out translation or maybe even promote? Because the translators have to find it worthwhile to there is that realistic aspect, they have to earn money too if they want to keep at this and keep producing great works, no?
Well, you see, in Korea, you're lucky by the Translation Institute does provide funding. In most countries, not. The translator just does it. And that's service more than profit.
Okay. So the heart has to be in service, and hopefully with more institutions and maybe more publications that publishers that support.
It has to be worth
and
translating.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Brother Anthony of Taizé. Thank you for coming in today. It's been a pleasure talking to you.